Welcome to Antarctica Did That For Me. We're a podcast for everyday people with a little adventure in their hearts. We're Keri and Cassa, and we've spent huge chunks of our time living and working in Antarctica. Welcome to a journey that changed our lives. We hope it will change yours too.
Welcome to another episode of Antarctica Did That For Me. I'm Cassa Grant. I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm here with the wonderful Keri Nelson.
Hey, everyone.
And today we're going to talk about, imposter syndrome, but specifically imposter syndrome and adventure, because this is a show about adventure and about Antarctica and how sometimes we want to take a leap, like going to Antarctica, but we get these insecurities or stories or thoughts that are like, who am I to do this? Who do I think I am? All of these kinds of things, which is also known in the wider lexicon as imposter syndrome.
Oh, imposter syndrome. I know it so well. I have it for everything.
And so do I. I had so much imposter syndrome that I didn't think I had it, actually. So that's part of why we're doing this episode. I actually am working on a project right now that is interviewing people around imposter syndrome. So that was also part of what inspired this episode. And the reason I started talking about imposter syndrome more in my business and what I do as a coach is because people were coming to me so much and saying, I really struggle with imposter syndrome. I'm crippled by imposter syndrome. And my initial reaction to that was a very kind of what I would call like a Montana pragmatic, like, get over yourself. Like, nobody cares about you enough to even think you're an imposter. This is kind of my thing, right? Like, this is my initial reaction. And I started, but I was really curious. It did make me really curious. It's like, what exactly are people experiencing when they are feeling this way? How does it show up for different people? And also getting curious about myself, like, why did I have that initial reaction of like, oh, get over yourself? And for me, it actually came from, I think, growing up in a very rural area, being raised by a single mother and being raised poor. I think I've basically always had imposter syndrome. And I just didn't know that's what it was. And so then I kind of, in a weird inverse way, was just like, well, I can't even entertain those thoughts very much because I never belong anywhere. So whatever.
Right.
So you were saying that you struggle with imposter syndrome too, Keri. Like, is there anything that comes to mind for you when we talk about this?
I mean, I think I have imposter syndrome for every new move that I make in my life. I think when we started this podcast, Cassa, I don't know if you were, you probably weren't, but experiencing an enormous amount of imposter syndrome. Like, who am I to talk about Antarctica and make myself sound like an authority about this subject? Why would anybody want to listen to me? I'm experiencing it right now as I'm writing a book. I think I told you about Antarctica. And so as I write this book about my experiences and that sort of thing, even though they were my own experiences and I'm writing about my impressions of Antarctica, I still feel like I'm an imposter. Who on earth would want to listen to what I have to say? Can I write well enough to be read by professionals or anything like that? So I feel like I have imposter syndrome for everything. It's ridiculous.
I agree. And like I said, it can be really, really crippling. And especially speaking to the people that I've done about 20 interviews so far, and I want to do more. And I don't know what I'm going to turn that into, actually, but I'm just really curious. But I will say, the interesting thing about it has been that the way that people experience this shows up so differently. And actually, that was something that I really did not expect when I was looking at this.
Give me some examples. I'm so curious about that.
Yeah, for me, I thought people were going to say, okay, well, I feel like an imposter and I feel like it holds me back from doing things. And that has come up for sure. But there's this kind of interesting narrative too that has come up a little bit, which is imposter syndrome makes me better. Because if I don't have imposter syndrome, that means that I'm like a cocky asshole who is full of myself, essentially.
Oh, interesting.
Like, because I'll ask them, what is the opposite of imposter syndrome for you? And see where they go with that. Like, and usually a lot of people will go to a negative opposite. Right. So it's kind of this idea of modesty and being humble is being equated with imposter syndrome, which is super interesting to me. Like I said, I don't know what that's all about, but I definitely am hearing people say that.
And in that way, confidence is a negative trait then, like
in
more
that
of
kind of thinking. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. All of us can only speak for ourselves when it comes to what we're manifesting inside ourselves when we're feeling like we could be having imposter syndrome. But for me, it would just be like having all of my worst fears about myself spoken out loud and realized and having them out in front of everybody and just the surety that everybody else also thinks my worst criticisms that I'm lodging to myself on the inside, I think is what's going on for me.
Yeah, and me too. And I think that it's that inner critic that can really be overwhelming. And one of the quotes that I like that I've experienced in some of the research I've been doing is this whole idea of imposter syndrome being, I don't know what I'm doing, and soon everyone's going to find out, and shifting that to, I don't know what I'm doing, but soon I'll find out, and how that thinking affects our actions as well.
Can you explain what you mean when you say that phrase, the difference between soon they'll find out versus soon I'll find out, like what that means to you?
Soon they'll find out. It's underlying that is the idea that I'm a fraud. I'm a fake. People are going to find out that I'm faking it. And this is where actually the phrase "fake it till you make it" really contributes to imposter syndrome. Like you actually have to be it till you are it instead of faking it till you make it. Because if you are constantly faking it, there can be a level of getting into action that I think people are trying to say when they say "fake it till you make it," and I think that is true. You do need to get into action. But when you constantly know that you are faking it, it just continues. You're just constantly looking for someone to expose you as a fake, as a fraud. And so that's
Right.
that whole I don't know what I'm doing, and they're all going to find out. Whereas if it's I don't know what I'm doing, and soon I will find out what I'm doing. Here, soon I will get better at what I'm doing. Soon I will find out is a different way of, that's basically a growth mindset lens to look at it from.
Okay, that makes sense. So, I mean, I definitely, the concept of me being a person who could be Antarctican or somebody who could be part of that community, that Antarctican society, that was a spot where I experienced some imposter syndrome. Like I'm just this girl who likes to go to the mall. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not adventurous at all. I'm just this dumb girl. That I experienced some imposter syndrome when I thought of myself in that environment. So what do you, in your business, when you talk to people about imposter syndrome, what do you tell them about overcoming it, about dealing with it?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that really play it. And that's actually part of why I'm having these interviews and talking about this with people, because I want to know, again, how people are experiencing it and help myself overcome it as well as them. So there's a couple of things. One of my friends sent me this really great address, like it was a commencement address, but it was a speech basically. And this woman was talking about how imposter syndrome is actually institutionalized as well as internalized. But a lot of times we take it all in ourselves, right? It's all on
Right.
me. I'm an imposter. I'm not good enough. Like all this, the inner critic keeps going, right? And the whole roots of the words imposter syndrome, it was like basically something that this researcher named Leslie Jameson came up with years ago. They didn't mean for it to be pathologized as a syndrome. It's actually thoughts. It's imposter phenomena. It's imposter thoughts. It's not really this kind of syndrome. This is how we talk about it. So this is why we're talking about it in this way. But it's not something like a disease, right? It can be a disease of thinking. It can be, if you let it be a disease of thinking, it can be, but it's really more about these thoughts. But they started to notice that, especially in the 70s, as Title IX took over and as women started to gain more rights, this imposter syndrome and idea started to gain a lot more traction. And this idea that you should just fix yourself if you have imposter syndrome is a problem. It's problematic because there's two things that involve. It's like if there's a lot of institutions or businesses or places that are not designed for people who are like you. So in this instance, I will say I'm a white woman from the backwoods of Montana. By default, I will always feel like an imposter because I actually don't belong in those places. Right? They weren't designed with me in mind.
They weren't for you.
No, they were never for me. And that's okay. But if we don't understand how that really affects and creates imposter syndrome as well, then we continue to pathologize it. We continue to put it all on ourselves. And so I think that there's two parts to this that are very, very important. And, when they say, okay, women should stand up for equal pay and you fight for yourself and get more pay. It's like, well, you know what? We can institutionalize that and just decree that everyone gets paid equally.
Right.
And then people won't feel like imposters, right? And I don't care who you are, you won't feel like an imposter because we're paying you this amount and you belong. And so for me, the opposite actually of imposter syndrome is belonging. How do I create belonging for myself, even when, these kinds of demographic type things are going to make me feel like I don't belong?
Right.
How do I create that?
That's so interesting. What would it have looked like to you if 100% of the people who worked in Antarctica were white women from Montana? You would not feel like an imposter then entering into that situation. What would it look like for me if 100% of the people who worked in Antarctica were Asian women? Like I would feel like absolutely I belonged, and in fact I should be there. So it is a really different turning of a lens. Would you say that imposter syndrome is quite a gendered phenomenon?
I would say more of the people that have been reaching, this is a very small sample size, obviously, but I would say that more of the people who have been reaching out to me and saying that they struggle with it are definitely, I would say probably 9 in 10 were women. It doesn't mean that men don't have it, obviously. Like a lot of men have it too. But I think it relates to them sometimes more professionally than just actually just in ways of being, like it can for women.
So if I'm somebody struggling with imposter syndrome, which we're saying, syndrome is the name we put on it. But if I feel like an imposter and it's holding me back, you're a coach who works with people. What do you tell me about changing that for myself?
Well, I mean, first of all, as a coach, I can't change my clients. And
Right.
I don't have any business trying. I can ask them questions, and that is what I do. And so it's really trying to help ask questions that are going to help people shed light on their own experience in a way that they have realizations rather than me telling them what they should think. Because first of all, I don't control that. Second of all, it's not appropriate for me to assume that I can give them information, which is what we're doing right now, obviously. Or, I can share my experience, and I do. I can share other clients' experiences anonymously, obviously, but I can help them feel not so alone, because I think that that's part of what the real challenge here too is, that we feel very alone when we have imposter syndrome and when it's really, really overtaking our situation. It's like, I'm broken. Nobody else has gone through this and there's no way out of it, or there's no way to I don't see the path to take the little penguin hops or the baby steps towards getting out of this, right? Like we get ourselves into that narrative. And so what I can do is kind of chip away at that narrative, and I can kind of go, well, what does that look like for you? Or how does that show up for you? Or I can also use basically logic to help them understand how their thinking might be tricking them. And what I mean by that is, like, I like to give the example of, like, okay, have you ever fixed a toilet?
I have not. I guess I have. Anyway.
Right.
I answered you, Cassa.
Actually. But this is actually a really good example of what I mean by a lot of this stuff, is that it's much more nebulous. When we believe that the imposter syndrome thoughts, the imposter thoughts, it's all or nothing. It's black or white. There's all these binaries. But a lot of times it's not the case at all. And so, for example, when I say, if you fix the toilet and you say, oh, we'll go with yes in this case, I will say, would you say that you're a plumber then?
I don't know.
Well, would you say, I'm a plumber? Now I'm a plumber. I
No,
fixed this
I would
toilet.
not say I'm a plumber.
Right. And most people would say that too, right? Most people would go, no, I'm not a plumber, right? But for whatever reason, when we have a failure, or when things are not as good as we want them to be, we will still take that identity and that mantle on as, I'm a failure. And, you can use binary thinking to help you. You would have to basically be dead, and then you'd be a failure, because just getting up and breathing in the morning, technically you cannot be a failure because you succeeded at breathing, right? Or,
right.
There's so many ways that you can. So this is where I can kind of start to, what I kind of jiggle their thinking and jiggle my thinking too, of like, when we have these thoughts, they create these canyons, and they're basically like a river running through the canyon. Every time you have the thought, it gets deeper and deeper. And so I'm kind of like trying to create a little earthquake here and get little tributaries coming off of that, so that we're not just in this tunnel where we can't see anything else.
Yeah.
And that's how that discussion happens, if that makes sense.
So do you have an example from your life where you've had those impostery thoughts, and then what worked for you?
For me, grad school really brought up a lot of this. I was kind of one of the first people in my families to go to grad school, and I was struggling with it because I just thought I was a big dummy from Montana. And grad school was a lot harder than many of the things that I've ever done. And that's one of the triggers that comes up. So, we have these triggers that will bring it up. And I had asked you what triggers it for you. And you had said something like doing new things, right?
Right. I mean, I don't know why I am so not self-confident, but I feel that way all the time. So all the new things make me think, oh, I don't know if I'm the one who should be doing this.
And that's fair. And again, it's like, you can have those thoughts. I mean, there's nothing wrong. It's just what you do with them, right? And so with me, with grad school, I was definitely thinking, oh, I'm just not at this level of thinking. I don't have the rigorous experience of thinking in this way. It was really challenging for me, to the point of being almost crippling, and to the point of like crying in my advisor's office at one point, just being like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And it was really, really powerful for her to give me a reflection back and go, you're one of the most interesting and thoughtful students that I've had. And I really appreciate that from you. Like I said, not feeling alone, not feeling like I was broken. And she shared her experience with imposter syndrome and how she had felt that way as a woman going to grad school in the 70s.
Yeah, wow.
And that was really powerful for me. And I can't say that then all of a sudden all my imposter syndrome was cured and everything was great. And I just put on my cape and flew away. But it really did help. It helped a lot. And so the more I can give that to my clients or to anybody that I'm working with, the better I think things are going to go for them. And so basically the best tool around this is growth mindset to combat imposter syndrome. So building awareness, like understanding when, okay, oh, here's an imposter thought. Hey, friend, here you are again. Oh, I'm back.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really does help to have somebody believe in you, somebody to be that outside voice of confidence when you're feeling those self-doubts. And so, I think that's, for all of us to think about when you observe somebody around you trying something new in their lives, that even just one cheer you on kind of statement, one I believe in you, one wow, you seem to be really on the right direction, you seem to really be on the right path, that can be tremendously powerful for the people around us who are also trying new things. I think we underestimate the strength that we can give to each other in those
Completely
moments.
Completely agree. And also that awareness that others can give us, like help us have that mirror that is like, not that you have to take their perceptions or their interpretations over your own, but to help remind you that these are interpretations, these are thoughts. And that's another thing that I'll ask people is, if they're treating it as a fact and they're saying, oh, well, I'm an imposter, well, would 100% of people on the planet agree with that? No, because first of all, they don't have reference, they don't have context, etc. So why are you treating it as if it were a fact? That is the question. That's just another way to help build that awareness. And then having perspective. So we talked about this with different levels of viewing things, and usually having a higher level and a higher perspective is going to help with that imposter syndrome.
I mean, I think back to the times when I've felt like I've had, which is all the time, as I've said, imposter syndrome, but I've done things, I've achieved things in my life anyway, despite that. And I think that for me, comparison and noticing other people in the world who have achieved the thing that I think that I can't achieve is helpful. So one of the first imposter syndrome thoughts that I had was when I was a elementary school student. We jumped from elementary school to high school in the school that I was in, and just thinking I'm never going to be able to handle what the big kids are handling, but then realizing everybody else in my town had gone to high school and they had graduated and done it just fine, and just seeing that other people around you are doing it, so therefore you can do it too. That was just jumping into it was helpful for me in overcoming imposter syndrome in my life.
For me, a lot of this also helped with travel, like we were talking about adventure, right? So you can actually view any challenge as an adventure, but it does bring up these doubts, inner critic thoughts, those kinds of things. And, when I went to Antarctica, like, of course, the first, I don't know, good while, I was definitely feeling like an imposter, even though I was certainly qualified to do the job I was doing. I knew people down there already. Like, I actually probably was set up pretty well for it, but I still kind of felt like, ooh, who am I to be hanging out with the cool kids or whatever, right? Like, there's always kind of that feeling when you go into adventure of, am I just fooling myself? Like, who am I kidding?
And it's so interesting. Once you take those steps, you realize how hard it wasn't to do that. Why, now that I've done this thing that I was so scared that I wasn't the right person to do that thing, and now it's just so effortless. It seems like the most natural and easy thing in the world that you have achieved this goal of yours. You look back and say, why did I wait so long? Why was I so scared of applying for that job, or of picking up that guitar lesson, or of, fill in the blank for things that you've been feeling inadequate about in your life. But rarely do they seem like big deals when you look back.
Yes.
So, I mean, so imposter syndrome can make things look really huge that aren't in reality huge at all. We're just building these mountains in our mind.
Again, there are other things that are going to contribute, like I talked about with institutionalized factors. But yes, a lot of this is internal. It's very internal. And so there are parts that you can say, okay, that is beyond my control of influence or even concern. But this is the stuff that you can control. So it's one of those things where it's figuring out, well, what can I control? And I mean, the last thing about growth mindset is thinking about how do you get into action? How do you take those little baby steps? And that's a part of why we have penguin hops at the ends of these episodes, is to help people just look for that next little step. And when we were talking about this episode, we were talking about imposter syndrome and the action that you took when you went to the job fair, when you were looking at going to Antarctica. I love that about your story, about how you went down to Antarctica.
Yes. Well, okay. So I'll share. The way I got to Antarctica was I went to a job fair in Denver, and it was back in the days when you would still have a paper resume. We weren't submitting resumes online then. So we all had our big sheets of paper standing in these long lines. And there were plenty of jobs that I applied for. I got in lines that I thought, I'm not probably qualified for this job. But I definitely then took my resume, dog-eared it, like folded it over on itself and said, put this on the top of the pile of people not qualified for the job. But I'm the best person not qualified for this job. Think about hiring me. And I ended up with some job offers from that method. So, I guess I was willfully being an imposter then.
But I love that. I mean, I absolutely love that story about you because it's like, it's one of those things that doesn't seem like a big thing that actually did basically change the course of your life, just to get real dramatic about it.
It did. Yeah, it really did.
And it was a little thing at the time. But if you had been like, oh, who am I to tell them that I should be at the best of the bad people pile, then you wouldn't have had the opportunity. You wouldn't have created that opportunity for yourself. And so this is where those little kinds of actions can actually really have those big impacts. And not that every single little action is going to completely change your life, but in this instance, it could. This is what I'm interested in, especially as I'm talking to people about this, is like, how is it holding you back? But also, how is it motivating you? Sometimes people are saying, oh, well, it motivates me because it helps keep me sharp and it helps me understand where I can improve. And I think that can actually be really helpful about imposter syndrome. There's a saying, like, if you don't have imposter syndrome with the people that you're hanging out with, then you're hanging out with the wrong people because you're not challenging yourself.
Right.
But it's more about how do you use that imposter syndrome and how do you understand the thoughts without letting it keep you down?
Oh, good one, Cassa. Okay, let's do the penguin hop. What do we got for the penguin hop today?
Well, what adventure are you thinking about right now? It's kind of a thought in this adventure that's exciting. We always talk about this, but notice if you've got that thought of who am I to do that thing? Or if I do that, everyone's going to see me as a fraud. That's probably a really good trail of breadcrumbs to follow and think about, why do I feel like this might make me imposter? And is it holding me back from doing the thing I want to do?
Oh, good one. Okay, well, think about that and then see you next time. Thanks for listening to Antarctica Did That For Me.
Thanks. See you.
Thanks for listening to the Antarctica Did That For Me podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support our efforts, we would love it if you would tell your friends. And if you leave us a review on Spotify or Apple, it will help us find more of our fellow adventurers. We release a new episode every Tuesday, and we are a video and audio podcast, so you can watch or just listen. We're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and more, or find everything, including links to our social media, at our website, antarcticadidthatforme.com. Thanks again for listening, and until next week, keep thinking about what opening your own heart to adventure could do for you.